Christian theologians and artists have always been in love with Jesus' mother, Mary, whom they named Theotokos, which actually means Mother of God. Liturgies, music, and prayers especially focused on her purity and on her suffering. One of the suffering moments, which is, if you listen carefully to Irene, you will realize this, one of those suffering moments not actually mentioned in Scripture was when Mary first held the body of Jesus after it was taken off the cross. This moment is called the Pieta, which can be translated as the pity or the compassion. Here's an early example of a Pieta, the Röntgen Pieta from the 14th century. It's a graphic and gritty image, and it moves me. Jesus' wounds still flow. He is emaciated, ugly, broken, just as you would expect of a crucified holy man. Mary is shocked, on the verge of disbelief, I think. Take a closer look here at their faces. The medieval German peasants who saw this Pieta in their church knew this kind of suffering for themselves. Medieval life was, as Thomas Hobbes said, nasty, brutish, and short. And the Röntgen Pieta offered those peasants both a Jesus and a Mary who they could identify with, because Jesus and Mary's suffering was their suffering. And yet there's an other darker side to this and similar devotional sculptures. The sculpture suggests that suffering itself is holy. Mary and Jesus' suffering here justifies suffering as a life reality that the peasants had to accept. If Jesus suffered, then you can suffer. The Röntgen Pieta, and many more like it, was used in this way by the church not only to teach and to nurture, but also to control peasant believers. Not so Michelangelo's Pieta. It served a very different purpose for a very different audience. This sculpture, found in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, is one of the most admired works of art of all time. The earthy realism of Röntgen is gone, and it's replaced by unearthly, impossible Platonic idealism. Mary, even as the mother of a 31-year-old man, is still a beautiful virgin, the prototypical perfect woman. And Jesus, even in death, is Adonis beautiful too. The story here is that Michelangelo was hired by the French Cardinal Jean de Béziers to create this sculpture for two reasons. It was to serve, and for a while it did, as Béziers' tombstone. But more importantly, Béziers was in Rome as a French ambassador after a disastrous war between France and almost all of the small Italian republics. It was a war marked by the brutal sack of Mordano, about 250 kilometers north of Rome, where the French army put all of Mordano's citizens, including women and children, to death. Now, after this inconclusive but brutal war, Béziers was supposed to help smooth things over. And so he tasked Michelangelo, an Italian artist, largely unknown, to use a notably French and German theme, the Pieta, to sculpt a work of Italian marble to place in the French chapel at the first St. Peter's in Rome, Italy. It was a peace offering that was supposed to tie these two peoples back together again. With Michelangelo's Pieta, the suffering of Mary and Jesus is just a passing whisper, as Béziers hoped that the suffering of Mordano in Italy might soon be forgotten too. The ugliness of war is here swallowed up by the stunning beauty of national reconciliation, symbolized by Jesus' reconciliation of humans to God through his death. The Pieta is a stunning piece of political theater. Which brings us to a much more modern Pieta, Pablo Picasso's Guernica. You've seen this painting. You know, I don't know how to speak of its beauty, its aesthetic excellence, but it is a striking and compelling and abstract work that just grabs the heart. Here Picasso painted the suffering of the village of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, just before World War II. The Nazi Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, bombed that little Basque village on market day. There was no military target. The purpose of this bombing of this little town was simply to sow terror. 250 townspeople died. It was a modern Mordano. Thus, like Michelangelo's Pieta, Guernica is very, very political. But instead of trying to smooth over war, Picasso wanted to put Nazi war crimes front and center, condemning them. And if you look very closely, you will see on the far left a Pieta, Mary holding Jesus in her lap. It's Rotgun all over, but now in Picasso's Cubist style. Do you see it there on the left? So, in case you can't quite see it, here is a reproduction done as a sculpture by well-known American artist Arthur Lopez in the Mexican-American Centero style. I have one more Pieta to show you, Benjamin West's The Death of Major General James Wolfe. You remember James Wolfe. He was the commanding British officer during the French-Indian War. The French were besieged at Quebec by British forces and tried to break through the British lines with a surprise attack on the Plains of Abraham, but they failed. The battle only took an hour, but during it, Wolfe was shot 3 times and died of his wounds. The battle led soon after to France's exit from New France, our Quebec. Wolfe has forever after been seen as Canada's first great war hero and the epitome of the British Empire's fighting spirit and military prowess. Wolfe's painting, of course, is yet another version of the Pieta. West, the painter, he knew Michelangelo's Pieta well from the years he lived in Rome as an art student. Here, West lays out General Wolfe as Michelangelo laid out Jesus. General James Wolfe is a sacrificial lamb who died to establish true civilization in the New World jungle. One commentator writes, the deliberate visual association between the dying General Wolfe and the dead Christ underscores the British officer's very admirable qualities. If Christ was innocent, pure, and died for a worthwhile cause, that is, the salvation of humankind, then Wolfe, too, was innocent, pure, and died for a worthwhile cause, the advancement of the British position in North America. In contrast to other paintings of Wolfe's death from the same era, West fills his painting not with regular soldiers, but with military dignitaries. In fact, none of these men were actually there. West added them to add dignity to the scene. One of those watching is a First Nations warrior, looking on Wolfe adoringly, in stark contrast to how most First Nations would have felt about these European wars that kept dragging them in. But West has no time for such modern objections. He's making myths that justify violence, greed, and visions of world domination that are at the root of all empires, including the British Empire. West here is an evangelist for war, on behalf of the crown and territorial expansion. All of which brings me near to the end of what I want to say this morning. All of these works of art that I've shown you served propagandistic ends. In each of them, the story of Mary holding Jesus' body, which should be merely a religious theme, was used to score political points. The Rotgen Pieta served the church's need to tell the story of Jesus to illiterate peasants who needed comfort and assurance and who needed to be kept in line. It said, "Shut up and embrace your suffering," like Mary and Jesus did, and then you'll be good citizens. Michelangelo's Pieta was meant to paper over war crimes. It was an offer of arm's-length platonic friendship as a substitute for war between nations. And Picasso's Pieta was exactly the opposite. It served as a condemnation of war by including a very Rotgen-like Pieta that represents the evil of war. And the question for us, of course, is this: will we let Remembrance Day, as well as its rituals and beautiful music, will we let it be used in a similar way? Or will we see through some of the myths to the fact of war's evil, to the actual pain and suffering of both soldiers and civilians? Will we perhaps use Remembrance Day to organize ourselves for no more war? This week we ought to remember the heroism of our boys, but we also remember Flanders fields and the poppies their bodies fed. We remember the World War I sacrifices of brave men at Vimy Ridge and the Somme and Passchendaele. But we also now understand that ultimately these battles were fought for the elites of a British empire against the elites of a German empire, rather than for any common good or high moral principle. We have fought other morally ambivalent wars as Canadians. The Royal Mounted Police against the Métis, the first overseas death of Canadian soldiers in a totally useless Anglo-Boer war that served mostly to make the British Empire richer by grabbing land illegally while brutally erasing Africans. But our boys also died fighting the horrific reality of Nazism in what is sometimes called the 20th century's only just war. Our boys liberated extermination camps and liberated my ancestors in Holland. But always, whether the cause is just or not, or just middling, our men were always true and valiant. And now I wonder, how will history judge our time in Afghanistan after the Taliban is back in control, as they seem destined to be? How will history judge our material support for Saudi Arabia in its ruthless war in Somalia? I do not know. But today we nevertheless remember the Christ-like suffering of our military martyrs. And in their memory, and to prevent the need for remembering more soldiers in the future, we commit our Remembrance Day not merely to making glorious national myths, but to learning the hard lessons of history. History as objective as we dare look at it. Even good wars are hell. We must do all within our power to avoid falling for heroic myths that cover over the reality of war, myths that want to use us. And instead, as a nation, we must build lasting peace wherever we can lend a hand. You know, I'm not naive. I know that hating war cannot end war. But I plead with you as followers of Jesus, who gave his own life as a protest against both religious bigotry and Roman military occupation, I ask you as followers of Jesus to use your social capital and your political and economic gifts and powers to help our nation make peace and keep peace. This is the most fitting remembrance of all. Now, we'll hear the Peu Jesu by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Peu Jesu means the compassion of Jesus or the mercy of Jesus. And in the context of the funeral masses, where different versions of Peu Jesu are sung, this beautiful motet is a sung version of the Pieta, focusing on Jesus now rather than Mary, but calling forth the same deep religious compassion. Let's listen.